Where do you start when you're building a view on global macro?
Well, great question. We start. So when we look at the macro, we talk about top down, right? So we talk about the big picture or the biggest picture. So initially, I used to look at bottom up. So I used to look at stocks and I used to look at the fundamentals, and then I used to work my way up. But increasingly I realized that a bottom up framework, while it works, it's great, but a top down framework is much better in this, or it works better for me in the sense that it helps me understand the environment that companies are in. It helps me understand, the different metrics that's going on and the different relationships in the economy. And then I drill down into stocks. So when I'm starting out, let's say I'm looking at a country, let's say we're looking at the US. So the first thing I would look at would be, how is the economy doing, right? So we want to know what economic growth is like. We want to know what inflation is like. We want to know what the policies are like. So right now, for example, the Fed is very, very important, right? For the longest time before, let's say, the pandemic, Fed interest rates were low. There was nothing much going on from the Fed. They weren't that important. But now that we've started this hiking cycle, it's obviously become much more important to understand policy. And that's the case all over the world. So we start with how the economy is doing, economic growth. We start with inflation, and obviously policies.
Mm. And I guess what gets important then depends on the regime we're in, is kind of what you just said there, is that the Fed becomes very important in certain scenarios, or it might be inflation in other scenarios, or economic growth in other scenarios.
Absolutely. So we look at the cycle, right? So the economy and and businesses, they always move in a cycle. And this cycle basically affects how businesses do, throughout time. So when we're looking at the cycle, we want to understand where we are in this cycle. So are we at the
Mm.
peak? Are we at the bottom? Are we recovering? Are we coming down? So that's basically what the cycle is like, right? So you have the main four, stages in the cycle. So, and understanding this, you need to understand the rate of change, right? So
Mm.
a lot of people talk about absolute numbers when it comes to macro, but what we really want to look at when we're looking at, the macro situation is the rate of change. So is growth increasing or decreasing? Is inflation accelerating or decelerating? So that's the kind of thing that's, important to remember. And there's one more
Mm.
thing that I want to add here. Remember that the macro, or the way that the cycle moves, can be quite slow. So often enough, we look at situations in the market and, we say, oh, the macro doesn't matter. And we say that because it feels like, each data point that comes out probably isn't influencing the market as much. But in the grander scheme of things, it does influence the market, right? And so the cycle moves very slowly. And then we're within the cycle, moving up and down with the market and with companies and consumer spending and so on and so forth.